The hall was glittering that night. Chandeliers sparkled, the stage shone with flowers, and music filled the air. My son's wedding was supposed to be the happiest evening of my life. I had imagined sitting with pride, watching him begin his new journey, knowing all my sacrifices had led to this moment. But happiness does not always come the way we dream. The bride walked toward me in her heavy wedding dress, her bangles clinking, her smile sharp. And then, in front of hundreds of guests, she said loudly, "Give me the keys to your house, hand over the property papers, transfer everything to your son's name right now." My heart stopped. Conversations froze. All eyes turned toward me. I forced my voice to remain calm. "Why should I do that?" I asked. Her smile fell. Without warning, her hand struck my face. A sharp, echoing slap. Gasps filled the hall. My cheek burned, but what burned deeper was my soul. She leaned close, her voice dripping with cruelty. "Because this house is no longer yours. It belongs to us, and if you resist, we will throw you out like dirt." I looked at my son, my blood, my pride, hoping for defense, for love, for at least one word of protection. But he looked down, silent, ashamed, or perhaps complicit. The music stopped. Whispers spread among the guests. Some pitied me, some smirked. The humiliation was complete. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I only touched my burning cheek and walked out of the hall. Every step was heavy, but inside, something harder was forming. That slap was not just an insult. It was a mark, a wound, a vow. And in that vow, my revenge was born. The slap still burned on my face as I left the hall. The noise behind me, the music restarting, the laughter of guests, the clinking of glasses sounded like a cruel joke. They carried on celebrating, as if my humiliation was just a small scene in their entertainment. I walked slowly, my sari brushing the marble floor, my heart beating louder than the drums of the wedding band. No one followed me, not my son, not his bride, not a single relative. Everyone saw the slap, everyone heard the demand, and yet nobody moved. The silence of their cowardice weighed more than the sting of the bride's hand. Outside, the night was cold. The parking lot was filled with cars, headlights flashing as guests arrived late or left early. Some glanced at me as I stepped into the dock, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and gossip. I could almost hear their thoughts. The mother was slapped by her own daughter. How shameful! How weak! I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and kept walking. My feet felt heavy, like I was dragging 60 years of sacrifice with me. Memories rose uninvited. Nights I had stayed awake when my son was sick. Days I had gone hungry so he could eat. Years I had worked to save for that house, brick by brick. And now, the boy I carried in my womb, the man I raised with all I had, let his wife strike me in front of the world. By the time I reached the corner of the street, tears finally escaped my eyes. Not for the slap, but for the betrayal. A stranger's insult cuts deep, but a child's silence cuts deeper. I stopped under a streetlight, staring at the shadow of my thin frame cast on the pavement. The shadow looked small, weak, defeated, but inside me, something else had awakened. That walk from the hall to the street was more than just steps away from a wedding. It was steps into a new war. I understood that night that I was no longer just a mother. I was a woman who had been stripped of her dignity, and I would not die with that shame. I whispered into the cold air, my voice trembling but clear. "They think I am weak because I am old. They think I will bow because I am alone. But they don't know I am not finished. The world will see what happens when you break a mother's heart." And with that vow burning inside me, I walked on, slower but steadier, into the darkness of betrayal towards a revenge that would one day outshine the slap that began it all. When I returned home from the wedding that night, the house did not feel like mine anymore. The keys were still in my hand, but even as I opened the door, I felt like a guest trespassing in her own place. The silence inside was suffocating. Thick walls, dim lights, and the echo of memories that no longer welcomed me. I walked through the rooms slowly. The living room still smelled faintly of flowers from the decorations I had set days earlier, trying to make the wedding preparations warm. The sofa had marks of guests who sat and laughed, eating sweets I had served with pride. Every object whispered of effort, of love, of years of saving and planning. And yet, that night, everything looked different, colder, like the house already knew it had been promised to someone else. I placed my shawl on the chair and sat, staring at the wall. The slap replayed in my mind, over and over, louder than any voice. My son's silence replayed too. That was the louder betrayal. Hours passed. When the door finally opened, it wasn't with the hesitation of children entering their mother's home. It was with the boldness of owners returning to claim what was theirs. My son walked in, his bride at his side. She did not glance at me. Instead, she threw her bag onto the sofa, took off her jewelry piece by piece, and called out to him, "Tomorrow, we need to sort the papers. I don't want any delays." My son nodded weakly, not a word to me, not even a glance. I rose slowly, my voice low but sharp. "Is this how you begin your marriage? By striking the woman who raised your husband, by demanding what is not yours?" The bride turned to me, her eyes gleaming with arrogance. "You should be grateful I even let you stay here tonight. By law, the house belongs to him, now and I am his wife, which means this house is mine. You are just extra." Her words cut deeper than the slap. I turned to my son, my eyes begged for a sign of love, of shame, of defense, but he looked at the floor, his silence more violent than any hand. That night, I sat alone in my room, my husband's photograph hung on the wall, his smile frozen in time. I whispered to him through my tears, "I built this house with you. We gave our lives to it. And now they want to erase me." The walls listened. The house, though claimed by others, still breathed my name. But I knew now it would not protect me. The house was empty that night, not of furniture, not of memories, but of love. An emptiness like that is worse than hunger. I lay awake until dawn, clutching the keys in my hand, knowing they would soon be ripped away. But I also knew one thing. They could take my house, but they could not take the fire that had already started inside me. That fire whispered one word over and over: revenge. Morning sunlight poured into the house, but it did not bring warmth. It brought tension. I sat quietly at the dining table with a cup of tea, though my hands trembled too much to drink. My son and his bride entered together, whispering in low voices. Their eyes were sharp, their footsteps heavy with purpose. The bride did not waste time. She sat across from me, her bangles clinking against the table, and said loudly, "It's time. Hand over the keys. Hand over the property papers. This house belongs to us now. The sooner you understand that, the easier it will be for everyone." I stared at her, disbelief hardening into anger. This house was built by my hands and my husband's sweat. It carries my years, my struggles, my sacrifices. You have no right to demand what you did not earn. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. I have every right. I am his wife now. He is the owner on paper, and what is his is mine. Don't try to act like you are still in control. My son sat silently beside her. His silence was heavier than her words. It was not ignorance, it was agreement. He would not speak for me, because he had already chosen his side. My voice cracked, but it held steady. "You are asking me to give away my soul, my life's work, my home, and you dare ask it with no shame." Her smile was sharp. "Shame is for the weak. Strength is taking what you want. And right now, I want those keys." She reached across the table, her hand snapping toward the keychain I kept in front of me. Instinctively, I pulled it back, clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a moment, our eyes locked, her arrogance against my fury. The silence in that room was filled with battle. Finally, she leaned back, her voice dripping with poison. "If you don't give them to me willingly, we'll take them. By law, by force, and when we do, don't expect us to let you stay." I looked at my son one last time, searching for love, for remorse, for anything human, but he kept his head down, his fingers tapping the table nervously. Not once did he stop her. At that moment, I realized the truth. I was no longer a mother in his eyes. I was an obstacle. I stood slowly, holding the keys tight against my chest. "You may think paper and law make you strong," I whispered, "but remember, this houses can be stolen, but curses are earned, and a mother's curse is heavier than stone." Her laughter rang out, cruel and mocking. "Old women, and their curses, useless words. Let's see how long you last when you're out on the streets." I walked away, my heart burning. I knew now it was not a question of if they would throw me out. It was only when, and when that moment came, I vowed silently, it would not be the end of me. It would be the beginning of their downfall. They did not wait for a storm. They moved like a storm, quick, efficient, and unfeeling. The morning they came for me, the house felt smaller than it had ever been. The rooms that once held laughter now seemed to be waiting, as if time itself had been instructed to stand aside and watch a scene unfold. My son and his wife stood in the hallway with two friendsmen with blank faces and strong shoulders, who looked as if they had been hired to resolve problems, not understand them. One of them carried a clipboard, the other had a duffel bag already partially open. "Pack whatever you want. the bride said, voice smooth as glass, but make it quick. You have until noon. I remember looking at the clock on the mantel, a small gilded thing my husband had bought when our payments finally stopped bleeding us dry. The minute hand moved forward like a metronome, marking the time I had left in my own house. I walked slowly through each room before I began to pack. It felt like saying goodbye to pieces of myself, folding curtains that smelled of jasmine and lemon, slipping sheets off a mattress that had known 30 winters and 30 summers, tucking away a tea tin that still held the faint scent of cardamom. I wrapped my husband's photograph in a clean scarf and tied it tight, as if securing his smile would keep me steady. I put my ledger, the little book where I had kept savings, receipts, and embarrassingly meticulous list to the tin box. I found the old iron key in the jar, where I had always kept it, and held it in my palm until the skin warmed. There men watched me do it all with that impassive look people use when they have been told not to feel. The bride stood by the doorway, arms folded, feet planted like a judge, ready to announce a sentence. My son lingered near the kitchen, eyes averted, jaw working. For a moment I thought he might come close and put a hand on my shoulder, say the word I needed. Sorry, mother, I was wrong. But he did not. He swallowed and walked outside to talk on his phone. I could hear the low murmur of his voice and the rustle of paper. His absence felt deliberate, the silence loud and chosen. When I had filled the last small bag with the clothes I deemed necessary, I picked up the keys and went to the living room. The house looked at me, shelves lined with old novels, a clock that had run for decades on a coil of wound-up faith, a sofa with a small drink stain I had once promised to clean. I had lived here through births and funerals, through celebrations and quiet Sunday mornings when my husband and I would read the paper together. I touched the arm of the sofa like one might touch a relic before it is taken away. The bride flicked her eyes toward me, impatient. Now, she said, we've wasted enough time. One of the men moved forward, and gently so, they thought, took the bag from my hands. I felt a tremor go through me that had nothing to do with cold or age. It was the raw, animal reaction of someone being stripped of shelter, of safety. The man did not seem to notice the look in my eyes. He was used to carrying other people's luggage, I suppose. Perhaps he had no idea what he was taking besides cloth and a little tin. At the doorway, just before the last light left the room, I paused. The sunlight hit the moats, drifting in the air, and lit up the dust like tiny golden lanterns. For a second I could see the life I had spent building laid out in silhouette: the hands that painted a fence, the face that baked bread, the small boots of a child who had once chased butterflies in the yard. It all felt so fragile then, like paper boats on a river. They closed the door behind me with a practiced click, one of those small, everyday sounds that now felt like an orchestral finale. For a second I stood there in the threshold, the world outside a little too bright, a little too loud. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid eye contact. A dog barked insistently from a porch. A child raced by on a tricycle, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. The wedding decorations that had still been scattered in a box on the side table rustled as if protesting. "Do you need a ride?" one of the reluctant relatives asked, as though offering transportation absolved them of participating in the rest. "No," I said, "thank you." My voice came steady, even though my hands shook. I had always prided myself on being economical with pity. It seemed pointless to accept a favor that felt like charity after such violence. They put me in the car. His bride's father drove in. The view of the house receded. I watched the porch light blink once and then wink off, like a small eyelid closing. The car's heater hummed, and the world outside passed in wet rectangles as we slid through town. They dropped me at a cousin's small apartment, several blocks away, a temporary arrangement the bride had arranged, as if placing me somewhere small would make me less of a problem. The cousin was kind enough on the surface. She pressed a cup of tea into my hands and asked about my health, her eyebrows knitting in a way that made me think of old, practiced concern. But when I tried to speak about my son, her face tightened and she changed the subject. I felt the margin of conversations draw away from me, as if anyone near me risked being contaminated. That night I lay on a sofa that protested with every movement. I pressed my face into a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender and foreign soap. For years I had thought that humiliation would break me. But humiliation is a strange instrument. It sharpens the edges of a person if she does not allow it to dull her completely. I slept fitfully, dreams populated with the sound of that slap, replayed and replayed until it felt like a drumbeat. In the days that followed, The normal things of life became mine in a new way. I learned the names of the neighbors in the small building where I had been deposited. I found a nearby bus stop and began to watch the routes the city took. I found solace in small routines, washing my face each morning in cold water, finding the cheapest bread at the corner shop, reading the same paragraph of the paper until it sank in. These small acts stitched me into a present that was different from the one I'd lost, but the humiliation clung like a second skin. The slap in the wedding hall had been seared into me, and every passerby's glance felt like a reflection of it. Friends called and said the usual things: how could this happen? But their help was cautious, as if daring too much involvement might bring their own households into trouble. A few neighbors offered a plate of food. A cousin sent a short text message: "We can talk later. Don't make waves." That phrase, "don't make waves," felt like a blade. It was as if the world had decided my dignity was a trouble they'd rather avoid than right. Meanwhile, back at the house they had thought to claim, life continued in the narrow lanes of the newly confident. The bride had rearranged the living room to her taste, the old curtains replaced with ones that showed a more modern pattern. The photographs on the mantel shifted around so that her face looked comfortable in the spaces where my family once breathed. I watched it all from the windows of my borrowed room, and for the first time in my life, I felt the absolute hollowness of being erased by those you loved. But somewhere inside the hollowness, a slow, steady ember started to glow. The slap had been loud, yes, and cruel. Yes, but it had also been a call to something older. The woman who had scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, who had sewn and saved and held the household steady through storms, who had learned stubbornness like a craftsy, did not simply fold when a younger pair of hands sought to take everything. She learned the map of hurt. She catalogued the betrayals, and she began to recognize the edges of an opportunity. The first step was survival, the small routines that kept the body intact. The second step, and the one that would come like a tide, would be to turn the humiliation into fire. I began to think about paper, about names, about the single act on a single day that had shifted everything. I thought of signatures and witnesses, of the quiet ways legal systems sometimes bless cruelty. I thought of the way the bride had demanded the keys in front of the crowd. I remembered the men with stoic faces who had carried my bag. I slept that night with my husband's photo clutched to my chest and a plan stirring at the edge of my mind. Revenge, I told myself, would not be loud spectacle. It would be careful, patient, lawful violence and unmasking of greed and ingratitude. It would be a recovery of what was mine, piece, by law, by truth. They had thought that by taking my home, they had taken me. What they did not know was how much strength a woman carries when pushed to the edge. The throwout had taken my house. It had not taken my memory, my proofs, my stubbornness. It had not taken my dignity, though it had tried to bruise it. The next stage of this story would require more than prayer. It would require strategy, evidence, and above all an ally. And I would have won, you said, the first morning after I left the house for good. The city felt enormous, an ocean of noise and movement, where I was suddenly a pebble. I had never imagined that a place could hold so many people, and yet make a single person invisible in the span of an afternoon. Streets I had driven down my whole life now looked foreign, storefronts like islands of commerce I could not afford to visit, and the hum of traffic sounded like a conversation that had no place for me. I learned the lines of the city the hard way. The alley behind the library was warmer in wind than the open square. The shelter closed its doors early on weekdays, but had a breakfast queue in the mornings where volunteers handed out coffee and warm rolls. There was a deli whose owner always smiled and slipped me an extra sandwich when business was slow. A small mosque on Elm Street opened its back room during afternoon prayers and let the elderly nap on worn carpets. I began to map these kindnesses, like secret ports on an uncharted map. Hunger has a vocabulary all its own. It speaks in aches and in the way the elbow bones begin to feel sharp when you haven't eaten for a day. I learned to ignore the first pangs so the body would save energy. I learned where to stand so my clothes wouldn't look too new or too ragged. So pity would arrive like a slow faucet instead of a splash. Humiliation, though, is harder to budget. The worst moments were not the empty stomach or the cold nights, but the eyes of people who recognized me from the wedding footage online, the ones who had watched the slap go viral and had whispered in the market about the mother who was slapped. Their pity was a public thing, loud and shallow. Strangers offered pity, as if they were throwing coins into a fountain and walking away. Sleep was a negotiated thing. A church porch is warm until the security guard arrives. A bus station bench is consistent until morning maintenance sweeps you away. I learned to roll my shoulders and tuck my knees so my body took up less space and looked less like an invitation to trouble. Once, a man asked if I wanted to share his blanket. Another night, the rain soaked through my coat and I huddled in a stairwell until dawn. The concrete seeping heat into my bones, as if the city were trying, in its indifferent way, to cradle me. People who live on the street tend to be generous in the currencies. They can spare stories and small favors. An old woman named Rosa taught me which soup kitchens closed on Sundays so I wouldn't go hungry that day. A young father showed me which libraries let people sit in the warmth without buying anything. Small communities formed out of necessity. We traded news, where free clinics operated, which buses ran late, who needed help with a form at the social services office. I learned to listen. When you have nothing else, hearing another person's trouble and offering a small shoulder becomes currency. But the hardest lesson was how quickly the mind can try to shrink you. People say that being uprooted is only about lacking a roof. They are wrong. It is about the erosion of identity. I had always been someone who had a name on a mailbox, who received bills and invitations. Identity lived in the way the postman said, "Good morning, Odessa," in the way neighbors asked for small favors. Once that stopped, you feel your name slipping. I found myself answering with a smaller voice, then a whisper, until I had to catch myself and say my name aloud just to remember it still belonged to me. There were cruel moments. A group of teenagers once circled me near a park and mimicked the wedding video, laughing as if they were reenacting a scene from a show. I could have felt anger, but what rose instead was a cold clarity. Anger without plan is noise. The slap had been noise. My life now needed something else: shape, a line of action. I would not throw plates or scream in public. What would hurt the most would be the slow, legal return of what had been taken. So I began to build. The stranger who would help me did not appear as a sudden deus ex machina. Help in the city comes like water, finding a seam it seeps through the concrete where the cracks are. He found me at a bench where I sold small hand-stitched sachets of lavender I had made years ago to tourists who liked ethnic things. He was a volunteer at a legal clinic near the municipal building. He sat down, introduced himself simply, and asked the kind of questions that returned meaning. "Do you have any documents?" "Are there neighbors who know you? Would you like help?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want help, but because asking for it feels like exposing a wound. Then I looked at his hands. They were ink-stained, like someone who writes petitions and notes and files for a living. There was a steadiness in the way he listened that felt like a small, practical mercy. I told him the story, from the slap to the throw-out, slowing down whenever the memory threatened to swallow me. He did not flinch. When I mentioned the deed, the photo, the little tin of receipts, his eyes changed. "We can work with that," he said. "You don't have to prove your life to me. You have proof enough for a case." We started slow. He took down names and pages, and I handed over the tin box that had traveled with me since the day they shut that door. Each envelope inside was a relic: a water bill with my name on it, a stamped letter from the tax office, a faded photograph of a child's birthday in my living room. He made a copy of everything in his notebook and promised to find an attorney who would take the case pro bono if needed. I thought, perhaps the law is not entirely blind, yet the city is also full of hard practicalities. We had to find a lawyer who would risk taking on a family dispute that could get messy. We had to find a place to keep the photocopies safe. We had to make an appointment at the clerk's office where forms and fees could be navigated by someone who knew the system. The young mankind, efficient, unafraid, taught me which doors to knock on. He made phone calls and sent emails and dragged me from one line to another. Explanations and re-explanations, rendering bureaucracy more human. There were days when the weight of it all made me want to stop. There were evenings I would go to the bridge and sit on its cool concrete, watching headlights smear across the river, and let the tears come. But in the morning, I rose and returned to the work. There is a particular dignity in small, stubborn acts: filling out a form, going to a hearing, checking the mailbox for a response. Each small action stitched the widening distance between who they called me and who I truly was. Slowly, as evidence accumulated, I noticed something else changing inside me. Anger had once been a raw animal. Now it became a tool. I learned to speak clearly, to keep the details in order, to practice telling my story not as a wail but as testimony. When I practiced in front of the mirror, I watched my face harden into something different, resolve, not bitter. There is a beauty to resolve that is colder than rage and steadier than grief. One afternoon, as autumn pulled the heat out of the air and pushed it into the gutter, the young man came to me with good news. A lawyer at the nonprofit legal clinic had agreed to meet and hear the case. He said the words I had begun too long to hear. There are grounds for undue influence. We can file. The relief that flowed through me that day was not like joy. It was more like the release of a long-held breath. The streets had taught me many things: how to survive, how to accept help, how to hide a fear so it wouldn't become a target. But the deepest lesson was this: being pushed out does not mean you cease to have effect. I had been made small in public, but my life's work, my payments, my receipts, my neighbors' memories still existed. Paper remembered, people remembered. The law, when guided by witnesses and records, could be a backdoor to dignity. So I stitched myself into that work. I cataloged the receipts in a clean notebook I bought with the last of my savings. I learned to keep my voice level when telling strangers the story. I drank cheap tea and saved bus fare. The nights on the street grew fewer as I moved between friends and the shelter. The cold easing because of a borrowed blanket or a volunteer's small heater. The ember inside me flamed into a manageable, steady fire. On some nights, the city felt merciless. On others, it offered up small, human kindnesses like twin candles in the dark. But always, through it all, I kept my eyes on the law, on paperwork, on the meticulous bookkeeping that would turn humiliation into remedy. Revenge, I decided, would not be a shout. It would be the hush of justice, falling into place, papers restored, name returned, pride reclaimed. When I finally stood in front of a clerk to sign the paperwork that would set the case in motion, I felt like a woman who had learned how to speak a new language. It was the language of forms and hearings, of witness statements and affidavits. It was not the language of the slap or the wedding hall laughter, but it was the language that would, I trusted, take me back. The streets had taught me to be invisible. I had learned to be seen again. The first time I saw him properly was at the shelter cafeteria. I had a paper cup of thin soup in my hands, and I was staring at the steam like it might hold an answer. He noticed me from across the room, not with the empty pity most people carried, but with a steadiness that made me look up. He sat down beside me, his plate untouched. "You're Odessa, aren't you?" His voice was soft, but not weak. I stiffened, clutching my soup tighter. "Yes." "How do you know my name?" He gave a half smile. "People talk. They whispered about you at the bus terminal. The woman thrown out of her own house, slapped at her son's wedding." He shook his head. "That's not gossip. That's injustice." I wanted to leave the table, but something in his tone stopped me. He didn't say it like a rumor. He said it like a verdict. "I'm a law student," he explained. "I volunteer here sometimes, help people with legal aid. When I heard your story, I couldn't forget it." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with quiet anger. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." I hesitated. For weeks, I had carried the shame of that slap like a stone in my chest. Telling the story meant reopening the wound. But his presence, the way he didn't rush me, the way he listened as if each word mattered, loosened something inside me. So I spoke. I told him about the wedding, about the demand for keys and papers, about the slap that echoed across a hall filled with guests. I told him how my son stayed silent, how the bride's arrogance filled the house like smoke, how eventually they had pushed me out, locking the door behind me. I told him about the streets, the hunger, the cold nights, the humiliation of being invisible. He didn't interrupt once. His jaw tightened as I spoke, his fists clenched, but he let me pour it all out. When I finally fell silent, trembling with the weight of my own words, he leaned forward. "Odessa," he said firmly, "you are not alone anymore. What they did to you is not just cruel, it's unlawful. We can fight this. You can fight this, and I'll help you." Tears blurred my vision, but I have nothing left. No money, no power. They hold everything. "You still have the truth," he said. "And you still have documents, don't you? Bills, receipts, old papers. You said you kept a tin box." I nodded slowly. "Yes, I still have it. It's all I managed to bring with me." He smiled for the first time, and it wasn't just candid, it was fierce. "Then, we have enough. Paper remembers what people try to erase. And witnesses remember too. You think they're strong because they have the house. But the law doesn't care about arrogance, it cares about evidence. If you trust me, Odessa, we'll take them to court." I studied him. this young man with fire in his eyes, a stranger, yet already more of a son than the one I had raised. My voice broke as I whispered, "Why help me? You don't even know me." His reply was simple, but it cut into my heart, because if people like me stay silent, then the slap wins, and I won't let that happen. For the first time since that night at the wedding, I felt a spark inside me, small but real, hope. That evening, when I lay down on my cot at the shelter, the slap still echoed in my memory, but this time it was met by another sound, his voice promising me justice. And I knew the fight had begun. The young man, his name was Daniel, showed up the next morning with a notebook in his hand and determination in his eyes. He wasn't dressed like a lawyer yet, no suit, no tie, just a plain jacket and worn sneakers. But there was something sharper than any polished lawyer in him, conviction. "We can't just go to court with words," he said, sitting across from me at the shelter cafeteria. "We need proof, we need strategy, and we need witnesses." I looked down at my hands, aged and trembling. "They have everything now. The house, the money, even the papers. What do I have left?" "You have time," he said firmly, "and memory, and that tin box you carried." That evening, I unlocked the tin box with trembling fingers and laid out its contents on the cafeteria table between us. Utility bills with my name, tax receipts, letters with the address printed boldly, old photographs, birthday parties, Christmas dinners, my husband standing proudly outside the house, every scrap of paper I had saved, thinking it might one day be useful. Daniel picked them up like they were treasures. "This is gold," he murmured. "Paper is patient. It remembers what people try to erase. These will speak louder than their lies." But he didn't stop at papers. "We need people too," he said. "Neighbors, friends, anyone who can testify that you lived in that house for decades, that you built it, that you paid for it." The thought of knocking on doors again made me shrink inside. Some had already looked away when I passed them in the street, afraid to get involved. But Daniel's certainty was contagious. "Some will turn us away," he admitted, "but not all. Even 2 or 3 witnesses can change everything." For the next week, we walked together, street by street, knocking on doors I thought had been closed forever. Some people frowned and muttered excuses, others shut the door quickly, fear or gossip weighing heavier than kindness. But a few just enough opened their doors fully. Mrs. Collins, who had lived next to me for 20 years, pressed my hands in hers. "I saw you pay those bills every month. I saw you shovel snow alone after your husband passed. If you need me, I'll speak." Mr. Thompson, the retired mailman, chuckled softly. "I delivered your letters for 30 years, Odessa. They all had your name. If they say otherwise, I'll call them liars in front of the judge." And little Emily, grown now, with children of her own, hugged me tightly. "You were like a grandmother to me. I'll never forget that house was yours." Each yes was like a stitch sewing me back together. At night, back at the shelter, Daniel sketched out the plan. "We'll start by filing for elder abuse and undue influence. The transfer wasn't fair, it was manipulation. Once the court sees the pattern, we can push to have the deed reversed." I listened, my heart heavy but burning with something new. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a fight. Before I slept, I whispered into the dark. "They thought they had ended me with a slap. But they don't know. I am rising, and this time, I am not alone." The days that followed became a rhythm of footsteps, papers, and memories. Daniel and I moved through the city like quiet hunters, not chasing animals but chasing proof that I had not imagined my life, that my decades of sacrifice had left a mark deeper than a slap or a signature. The tin box was our anchor. Daniel carried copies of everything in a folder, while I clutched the originals like relics. We visited the county clerk's office first. The building smelled of dust and ink, its walls lined with files that held entire lives of people who had long turned to ashes. After waiting in a long line, Daniel asked for property tax records, mortgage histories, and payment ledgers. The clerk, a tired woman with glasses, squinted at me over the counter. "You really lived there 30 years. I straightened my back. "I didn't just live there, I built it." She handed over a stack of stamped copies with my name on them. I pressed them to my chest like holy scripture. Next came the neighbors. We visited house after house, gathering signed statements. Some hesitated, afraid of conflict, but Daniel's calm persistence worked like a key. "All you have to do is tell the truth," he would say, "and the truth doesn't put you in danger. Silence does." Mrs. Collins wrote her statement carefully, her wrinkled hands steady. "I watched Odessa live there and pay for everything. That house was hers. Mr. Thompson added his memory of delivering mail in my name year after year. Emily, the little girl I once cared for, cried as she wrote her testimony. She was always there, always. To see her thrown out was cruelty itself. With each document signed, with each statement notarized, I felt myself grow taller. My humiliation began to shrink, replaced by strength built of paper and ink. But proof alone was not enough. We needed courage, too. Daniel arranged meetings with attorneys at a nonprofit clinic. The first lawyer shook his head. Family disputes are messy. Courts don't like to undo signed deeds. The second one hesitated. It's a strong case, morally, but legally. Then came Ms. Harris, a sharp-haired attorney in a gray suit. She flipped through the folder, her fingers quick and efficient. When she reached the copy of the deed transfer, she paused. No independent counsel, no witness signatures, and they forced her out immediately afterward. She looked up, her gaze fierce. This is elder abuse. Plain and simple. I'll take it. My chest swelled with relief. After weeks of silence and exile, someone with power had finally said the words, "I'll take it." That night, Daniel and I sat on a bench outside the courthouse. The city lights flickered, and traffic hummed around us. "We're ready now," he said. "We have proof. We have witnesses. We have a lawyer. The next step is court." I nodded slowly. My heart still trembled with fear, but beneath the fear was steel. I touched the photograph of my late husband, which I carried in my bag. "We're coming home," I whispered. The slap that once echoed in my ears was now drowned by another sound, the rustle of papers, the steady footsteps of witnesses, the clack of a lawyer's pen, the sound of justice preparing itself. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not because of the weather but because of the weight it carried. Its stone walls were thick, its wooden doors heavy, and the echo of footsteps in its halls felt like the sound of judgment itself. I clutched my bag against me, the tin box inside, as though the weight of those papers could keep me upright. Daniel walked beside me, his steps steady, his voice low and calming. "Remember, Odessa is your story. Nobody can erase 30 years of truth. Let the documents speak. Let the witnesses speak. You don't need to perform. You just need to be who you are." Inside the courtroom, I froze. There they were, my son and his bride sitting at the defense table. My son's head was slightly bowed, but his wife sat tall, her chin raised with arrogance. Her eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and I saw, not shame, but triumph. She still believed she had won. The judge entered, robes sweeping, gavel striking once. "Court is in session." Their lawyer went first, standing tall, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Your Honor, the case is simple. The plaintiff willingly transferred ownership of her property to her son. The deed is signed, notarized, and legal. She may regret her decision now, but regret is not grounds to undo lawful transfer. My clients provided her with support and care. This is nothing more than an attempt to create conflict where none exists." The words made my blood boil. Support, care. They had thrown me out like trash. Then, it was our turn. Miss Harris rose from our table, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. She placed the thick folder of evidence on the bench with a heavy thud. "Your Honor, this is not a case of regret. This is a case of exploitation. A 60-year-old woman was manipulated into signing away her life's work without counsel, without protection, and within days she was humiliated in public, slapped at her own son's wedding, and cast into the streets. This is elder abuse, and we have the documents, the witnesses, and the testimony to prove it." The judge's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the folder. Then Ms. Harris called the first witness, Mrs. Collins. The old woman walked slowly to the stand, leaning on her cane, but her voice was steady. "I lived next to Odessa for 20 years. I saw her pay every bill, shovel every snowfall, plant every flower in that yard. That house was hers. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it." The defense lawyer tried to undermine her. "Mrs. Collins, do you have proof that she paid these bills?" She tapped her cane once, hard, against the floor. "The proof is in her life. I saw it with my own eyes. Are my eyes not proof enough?" The courtroom murmured. The judge scribbled something down. Next came Mr. Thompson, the retired mailman. He tipped his cap as he spoke. "I delivered mail to Odessa for 30 years. Every envelope, every tax bill, every letter her name was on it. If you say otherwise, you're calling the Postal Service a liar." Even a few people in the gallery chuckled at that. As I watched, my heart swelled. The neighbors I thought had forgotten me were standing tall, speaking louder than I ever could. Their words felt like bricks being laid back into the walls of my stolen home. Finally, the judge looked at me. "Ms. Odessa, would you like to speak?" I stood slowly, my knees trembling but my voice firm. "Your Honor, I gave my son everything, my years, my health, my love, my house. I trusted him more than paper, more than law. And for that, I was rewarded with a slap and a locked door. I am not here to undo love. I am here to undo cruelty. This house is not just wood and bricks, it is my life, and I will not allow anyone, not even my own blood, to erase me from it." The courtroom fell silent. Even my son shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. The bride clenched her jaw, fury burning in her eyes. The judge nodded slowly. "This court has heard enough for today. The evidence presented is compelling. The matter will continue, but I am satisfied there are serious questions of undue influence and abuse. We will reconvene with further testimony." The gavel struck. As I walked out of the courtroom, Daniel whispered, "That was powerful." They're scared now. I saw it in their faces, and for the first time, I believed him. The fight was far from over, but the ground beneath their arrogance had begun to crack. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension the day I was called back to the witness stand. I had watched my neighbors testify, seen Daniel's calm nods, heard Ms. Harris argue with fire. But now it was my turn to sit under the hard gaze of their lawyer, the man paid to dismantle me, piece by piece. I swore on the Bible, my palm trembling, then lowered myself into the chair. The wooden seat felt colder than stone. Across the room, my son avoided my eyes. His wife, however, smirked, her arms folded, her confidence sharp as a knife. Their lawyer rose. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tone polite but laced with venom. "Ms. Odessa," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "is it true you signed the property deed willingly, transferring ownership to your son?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady, "but I signed out of trust. I never thought that trust would be betrayed." He tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "But no one forced your hand, no gun, no threats at the time of signing." I clenched my fists in my lap. "No gun," I replied, "just words from my own child, words of care, promises of protection. I signed because I believed in love. That was my mistake." He pounced. "So what you're saying is, you regret your decision. But regret does not make a transfer invalid, does it?" For a moment, my throat closed. I saw the judge's pen move, the jury watching. Then I remembered Daniel's advice. The truth is stronger than their tricks. I leaned forward. "This is not regret. Regret is when you choose poorly and suffer for yourself. This is betrayal. Betrayal is when others use your love as a weapon against you. That is what happened to me." The gallery stirred. The lawyer's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "Isn't it true, your son and his wife offered you a place in a care facility better suited for someone your age?" My heart flared with anger. "Offered?" I spat. "No. They threatened. They told me I did not belong in my home anymore. They said I was too old to matter. A care facility was not kindness, it was disposal." His voice sharpened. "Do you have proof of these words?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, the slap, the silence of my son, the eyes of the guests who saw me humiliated in public. The proof is written on my cheek, even if the bruise has faded." The courtroom went quiet. Even the judge's pen stopped. The lawyer tried once more, his tone growing desperate. "Ms. Odessa, are you sure you're not simply confused? At your age," the words hit me like sparks on dry wood. I straightened, my voice rising, no longer trembling. "At my age," I said, loud enough for every corner of the room to hear, "I have buried a husband, raised a child, paid 30 years of bills, built a home brick by brick, and survived nights on the street. At my age, I have more clarity than you will ever know. Do not mistake gray hair for weakness. Do not mistake age for confusion. I know exactly what was done to me and I will not be silenced." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge rapped his gavel once to restore order, but even he hid the flicker of respect in his eyes. The lawyer sat down, defeated. My son stared at the table, his face pale. His wife glared daggers at me, her smirk gone. I stepped down from the stand, my legs trembling, but my heart steady. Daniel met me at the table, his eyes shining. "You just turned the tide," he whispered, and for the first time since that wedding night, I felt it too. The slap had been their victory, but the cross-examination was mine. The next hearing came faster than I expected, and by then the air in the courtroom felt different. The first time I walked in, I felt invisible, an old woman fighting shadows, but now, after the witnesses, the documents, and the cross-examination, the silence of the gallery carried weight. People were watching closely. People were listening. Miss Harris, my lawyer, was sharper than ever. She placed another stack of documents on the judge's bench: bank statements, proof of every mortgage payment, copies of tax receipts with my signature. Your Honor, she said clearly, this is 30 years of paper, 30 years of responsibility, 30 years of ownership, a lifetime of proof that cannot be erased with one coerced signature. The defense lawyer tried to object, but his voice had lost its polish. His arguments sounded thinner, as if even he no longer believed them. He shuffled papers, repeated phrases like legal transfer and valid deed, but they rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Then came the turning point. Miss Harris requested that the bride take the stand. The woman rose confidently, her jewelry glittering under the courtroom lights. She sat with her chin high, as though the trial were nothing more than a formality. Miss Harris began, her tone deceptively calm. At the wedding, in front of hundreds of guests, did you not demand the property keys and papers from Odessa? The bride smirked. I only asked what was already ours. And when she refused, did you not strike her across the face? Her smirk faltered, but only slightly. I disciplined her insolence. She was disrespectful to me. The gallery gasped. The judge's brows furrowed. Miss Harris's lips curved into the faintest smile. So, to be clear, Miss Harris pressed, you believe slapping a 60-year-old woman in public, demanding her house, and forcing her out within days was not abuse, but discipline. The bride opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, her confidence cracked. And is it true, Miss Harris continued, voice rising, that after gaining possession of the property, you and your husband began making plans to sell portions of it? The bride's eyes darted to my son. He froze. His silence shouted louder than any denial. The courtroom buzzed. The judge rapped his gavel, ordered. It was no longer just a trial. It was an unraveling. Their arrogance was being stripped bare, thread by thread, until only the ugliness beneath remained. I sat at the table, my hands clasped tight, watching them squirm. My son avoided my eyes. Shame or furor, perhaps both, itched across his face. His wife, once smug and untouchable, now fidgeted in her chair, her confidence melting under the heat of truth. When the hearing ended, Daniel leaned close to me. His voice was low, steady. They've hung themselves, Odessa. Their own words are the rope. I breathed deeply, the weight of months lifting from my chest. For the first time, I felt the slap from that wedding night, not as a wound, but as the beginning of their undoing. The tables had turned. The day of the verdict, the courthouse felt like a stage where everyone knew the final act was about to begin. The benches were crowded. Neighbors, reporters, even strangers who had followed the story since that wedding night. Whispers rippled through the room, but when the judge entered, silence fell heavy, like a blanket dropped over the crowd. I sat at my table with Daniel and Miss Harris. My hands trembled, clutching the edge of my shawl, but inside me, the trembling was different now. It was anticipation, not fear. Across the aisle, my son and his bride sat rigid. He stared at the table as if it might swallow him whole. She, though, still tried to hold her head high, though her eyes darted nervously around the room. The judge cleared his throat, his voice deep and deliberate. This court has reviewed the testimonies, the documents, and the behavior of the parties involved. The evidence shows a clear and undeniable pattern. A woman of 60 years, who built and paid for her home over 3 decades, was manipulated into signing away her property under undue influence. Within days, she was publicly humiliated, assaulted, and forced from her residence. He paused. The gallery leaned forward. The defense has argued that the transfer was legal, but law is not blind to context. A deed signed without independent counsel, followed by immediate abuse, is not valid. Consented is exploitation. Therefore, this court rules the transfer of property null and void. Gasps erupted in the gallery. My heart leaped. The judge's voice grew firmer. All ownership rights are restored to Odessa, effective immediately. Furthermore, this court recognizes the actions of the defendants as elder abuse. A report will be filed with Adult Protective Services, and further penalties may follow. The gavel struck once, twice, final. I could not breathe for a moment. Tears blurred my vision. Then Daniel's hand closed over mine, warm, steady. It's over, he whispered. You won. I looked across the aisle. My son sat pale, his shoulders slumped. the weight of his silence finally crushing him. His wife's face twisted with fury, but her arrogance was gone, replaced with disbelief and fear. They had come to take everything. Instead, they were leaving with nothing. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, I rose, slowly, my knees shaking but my back straight. For months, I had walked the streets with humiliation stitched into my skin. Now, I walked out with my dignity wrapped around me like armor. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones pushed toward me. One reporter shouted, "Odessa, how do you feel now that justice is yours?" I wiped my tears, lifted my chin, and said, "They thought a slap could erase me. But today, the law reminded them and reminded me that dignity cannot be stolen, not by blood, not by greed, not by betrayal." The crowd fell silent, and for the first time since that terrible night, I felt taller than my years. The verdict was not just my victory, it was my revenge. The day after the verdict, I returned to the house not as a beggar at the door, not as a discarded mother, but as its rightful owner. The court officer accompanied me, keys in hand, and when the lock clicked open, the sound echoed like thunder rolling through my soul. The living room was a battlefield of arrogance. My son and his bride had tried to redecorate, covering the walls with their taste, erasing every trace of me. But now, those things looked hollow, temporary. They stood there, bags half-packed, their faces drained of color. "This is still our home." The bride spat, her voice sharp, desperate. The officer shook his head. "You've been ordered to vacate. You have 48 hours to leave." Her fury turned to me. "You'll regret this. You think you've won, but without us, you're nothing." Old and alone, I stepped forward, my voice calm, steady, sharp as a blade. "I was alone when I built this house with my husband. I was alone when I raised my son after he passed. I was alone when you struck me at that wedding. And even in my solitude, I proved stronger than your cruelty. You are the ones who will regret it, not me." She tried to lunge toward me, but my son caught her arm. His eyes, for the first time, lifted to mine. There was no arrogance there, no only shame. He whispered, barely audible, "Mother." I raised my hand, silencing him. "Save your apologies for God. I gave you everything, and you stood silent while she broke me. That silence is your crime." The officer escorted them out, their suitcases clattering against the floor. Neighbors gathered in the street, whispering, watching. Some smirked at the fall of the arrogant bride. Others shook their heads at the son who had lost everything. When the door shut behind them, I stood in the quiet house. My husband's photograph still hung on the wall, though dust covered the frame. I touched it gently, whispering, "We are home again." But the revenge did not end at the doorway. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, then through the city. Newspapers carried the story of the old woman who fought back. "Elder Justice, Mother Regains Home After Public Humiliation." One headline read. The bride's arrogance became a tale of shame, the son's silence a warning whispered in families everywhere. They had not only lost the house, they had lost respect, reputation, and standing. Friends turned away, jobs slipped through their fingers, and everywhere they went, people remembered. The slap that once echoed against my cheek now echoed against their lives, louder than any courtroom gavel. I sat that evening in my living room, the walls warm with memory again. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was peace. Revenge was not in shouting, nor in striking back with my hand. Revenge was in patience, in truth, in the slow, merciless turning of justice. They thought they had ended me, but, in the end, I ended them. And as I sipped my tea, I smiled, not with bitterness, not with cruelty, but with the satisfaction of a woman who had reclaimed her dignity from the ashes of betrayal. The house was quiet again, but not the hollow, suffocating quiet of abandonment. It was the quiet of peace, of walls remembering laughter, of dignity restored. I walked slowly from room to room, my hand brushing against the furniture, the photographs, the curtains. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. This was no longer a house stolen, it was a home reclaimed. That night, I sat by the window, with a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air like a prayer. Outside, the street hummed with life, children playing, neighbors chatting, cars passing, and inside, I felt something I had not felt in months: belonging. I thought of the slap, the humiliation, the betrayal. I thought of the nights on cold benches, the hunger in my stomach, the pity in strangers' eyes. I thought of Daniel's hand reaching into the darkness, of Ms. Harris's sharp words, of the neighbors who spoke for me when I had no voice. All of it, the suffering and the struggle, had led to this moment. Revenge had not been about destroying them, it had been about reclaiming myself, about proving that an old woman could not be erased with one signature, one slap, or even months on the streets. My strength had outlasted their cruelty. My son and his bride had walked away with nothing. No house, no wealth, no respect. Wherever they went, people whispered. Their arrogance had turned into their curse. The world saw them now as I had seen them that night, greedy, ungrateful, and empty. That was their punishment, not just losing the house, but losing their honor. I looked at my husband's photograph on the mantel. His eyes seemed to shine in the dim light. "We did it," I whispered. "They thought they could erase me, but I endured. Our home is ours again." And in that moment, I understood the true result of my journey. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a lesson. Never hand over your life's work while you're still alive. Never trust papers more than your own hands. Love can be true, but greed can wear love's face. Protect what you've built, because it is not just property, it is dignity, memory, survival. I leaned back in my chair, the steam of my tea warming my face, and smiled softly. The slap that once broke me had become the fire that rebuilt me. And as the night deepened around my house, I felt not like a victim of betrayal, but like a survivor who had written her own ending, an ending carved from truth, justice, and the unyielding will of a woman who refused to be erased. The result was not only my home, the result was me whole again. The moral of this story: never hand over your property or life's work while you are still alive, no matter how much you trust your children or relatives. Love can change, greed can poison hearts, and once you give away your rights, people may forget the sacrifices you made. Property is not just walls and papers, it is security, dignity, and the proof of a lifetime of struggle. Protect it until your last breath, because trust without protection can turn into betrayal. True love from family is shown through respect, not demands.